This recording is for lesson 5, and we are going to be looking at Proverbs 14 through to 16. What I will do to give a sort of an overview of chapters 14 to 16 is to present some general statements about theme, about structure, about how the Proverbs in chapters 14 to 16 link to each other. And then afterwards, I'll go into a more detailed look at the verses that are relevant. And we will then look at a verse by verse analysis of each of these chapters. So to begin with, let's look at Proverbs chapter 14 through to 16 in terms of its overall theme and purpose. First of all, chapters 14 to 16 presents a tightly connected set of sayings that contrast wisdom and folly, especially regarding speech, the fear of the Lord, and God's sovereign ordering of human plans. So what we have in chapter 14 is we will have a series of sayings, and these series of sayings will have contrast. We will see the contrast between wisdom and folly. And the contrast will come in areas of speech. What's the contrast between the wise and the foolish in terms of their speech, in terms of how they react to the fear of the Lord and how they deal with the fear of the Lord, and also God's sovereign authority over all of humanity. Now, when we look at these chapters, we are going to see a sort of a gradual development.
Tab audio.
Oh, sorry about that. As I was saying, what we will see in these chapters is a gradual development or a movement from the household level or from the house, the family structure in chapter 14. We will move to the community and worship life in chapter 15. And then we will look at God's sovereignty in chapter 16. So now let's look at the overall structure of these chapters. What is it that these chapters are going to accent? What is it that these chapters are going to be exploring? Well, in chapter 14, as I said, we will have an assorted contrast of wisdom and folly. So there's going to be a contrast between the wise and the foolish. And we're going to be emphasizing, or the Proverbs in this chapter emphasizes the daily life. How is the life within the home, the workplace, the emotions, and the treatment of the poor. So there's going to be a contrast between how the wise and the foolish deal with these issues. In chapter 15, we're going to the Proverbs are going to focus on speech, teachability, whether or not the extent to which the wise is teachable as against the foolish that's scoff at, that scorn knowledge and teaching. We will look at, again, the worship, how they respond to worship. And also we will look at the Lord, that is Jehovah, Yahweh, the I am, how he sees the life of the wise person, how God envisions, how God responds to the life of the wise. And then in chapter 16, what we will have is God's sovereignty over human plans, the instructions that he will give to the king, the instructions that he will give, and the order that he has laid down for the moral ordering of the universe, of the created order. So this is what we will have as we look at chapters 14 to 16. We will move from the home, then we will go into the community. So we move from the home to the community to the world. Now, Proverbs chapter 14, there are some key issues that are emphasized in chapter 14. And the key issues revolve around wisdom in everyday life, the daily life of the wise, the daily life of the foolish person. So to begin with, what we're going to see in chapter 14, from the very outset, we will see a wise woman and how she builds her house as against the foolish one who tears it down. We will see in chapter 14 how wisdom operates as against how folly shapes the entire household and affects its stability. So on the one hand, the wise woman will build her house, and perhaps I will look at it and I might, if I forget to say it, I'm saying, no, the building here is not in concrete and cement. Well, they didn't have concrete and cement then, but it's not the physical structure building of the house, but it is the moral building. She is a homemaker, the way she builds her home in a moral, spiritual way, as against the foolish woman who tears down the house and affects its stability in a negative way. Now, we will see here in chapter 14 the fear of the Lord, and we will move into the fear of the Lord in terms of its ethics, its value system, its do's and don'ts, its moral right and wrong, how to live and how to conduct oneself. So the chapter links, and it does it very often, it links the fear of the Lord with upright conduct. The fear of the Lord is linked not only to upright conduct, but it is linked especially to honesty. It avoids envy, and it helps us to walk in the straight and narrow path. In chapter 14, what we have is speech and emotions. Now, many of the sayings in chapter 14 actually contrast have sayings that contrast the calm, thoughtful speech with impulsive, impetuous words, impetuous utterances, as well as the difference between the wise demonstrating patience as against the foolish being quick-tempered and showing that their inner disposition, their attitude, their outlook, their perspective if you wish, shapes their outward life in a negative way, by the way. Then, within the chapter as well, we will see social justice, how the poor are treated. We will see ignoring the poor. That is an affront to God. And we will see as well how mercy is shown, how the needy are treated. And when we show mercy and treat the needy in a positive way, we are actually honoring God. So this is what we have in chapter 14. Now, also in chapter 14, what we have is some things that we need to, that immediately catches our attention, pulls our attention into the reading of the text. So if we look at chapter 14 and verse 1, the wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tears it down. That is verse 1. Now, we will look at this as against the naive, that is the simple, the innocent. The simple, verse 15, believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. That's verse 15. Now, the tent of the upright is also discussed. If we look at verse 11 of chapter 14, the house of the wicked will be destroyed. But watch this now. But the tent of the upright will flourish. So that is what we have here in chapter 14. Now, if we were going to outline chapter 14, this is the outline that would make some semblance of sense, some idea where we can look at the verse, look at the chapter in a logical, systematic way. So if we're doing the outline as we normally do, when we look at chapter 14, verse 1 to 10, what we're going to see in those verses 1 to 10, is a preparation for daily life. That pericope, that section deals with preparation for daily life in verses 1 to 10. Then we have in verses 11 to 15 the preparation for the end of life. In verses 16 to 27, we have the fear of the Lord. And in verses 28 to 35, we have our duty as citizens. So now let us see if we can look at this section. First of all, chapter 14, verses 1, the first 10 verses, and see how we will look at these verses. Now, if we were to read it, the wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tears it down. Whoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is devious in his ways despises him. By the mouth of a fool comes a rod for his back, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. Where there are no oxen, the manger is clean. But abundant crops come by the strength of the ox. A faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness breathes out lies. A scoffer seeks wisdom in vain, but knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. Leave the presence of a fool, for there you do not meet words of knowledge. The wisdom of the prudent is to discern his way, but the folly of fools is deceiving. Fools mock at the guilt offering, but the upright enjoy acceptance. The heart knows its own bitterness, and no stranger enjoys, or no stranger shares its joys. So if we look at verses 1 to 10 here, we're going to come to certain very important issues. Now, we begin, first of all, where the wise prepare for the important matters of daily life. So the wise person, Solomon is saying, is going to prepare for how to live in this life. What do? They arrange their priorities, and they are careful not to neglect those things that are most essential. Now let us look at verse number 1. It says, the wise build their houses, the fools tear down their houses. What is Solomon saying and suggesting to us in this chapter? We have here a contrast between these two women. What does the wise woman do? She makes her home her first priority. We're told that she is a builder. She builds her house. And as I said earlier, what is being emphasized here is not that she's going to put up a physical structure. What is the situation here, though, is that wherever her family dwells, she is going to portray and put together a plan that will morally build her family. She is interested in building the moral, spiritual values of her household. She is the homemaker. Now, if we remember, when we looked at chapters 1 to 9, those verses, Solomon pays very much attention to the father, to the son. The father instructing the son as to how to live. But in this case, as he does throughout chapters 1 to 9, and here he does it in chapter 14, where he looks at the important role that the mother plays, that the female plays in the home. Yes, there is a God-ordained role for the husband, but a part of the moral upbringing, the moral development and nurturing of the child also rests on the mother. Okay? It doesn't mean that she is going to overstep and undermine the authority of the husband or the father in the home, but that she is also a participant in developing the moral nature of her children. And that, Solomon says, is a wise woman. Well, what do we know about this wise woman? Whoever walks in uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is devious in his ways despises him. And so what do we have here? If we look, we won't get there for now, but we will surely get there. But if we were to merge this chapter with chapter 31, though not a proverb of Solomon, we will see the kind of mother, the kind of wife that God expects within the home. So now let's look at verse 2. We're told in verse 2 that the righteous show their fear of the Lord, okay, by their upright lives. The wicked show that they despise the Lord by their perverse lives. So here again, we have the contrast between the person who is wise, the upright, the righteous person, as against the person who follows the woman of folly, who is evil, who is unrighteous. And what does Solomon say here? It's going to be important that we see in this chapter the idea that the fear of the Lord is mentioned 3 times in this chapter. It is mentioned in it is mentioned in verse 2. Remember the fear of the Lord. It is mentioned here 3 times in this chapter. And it also again appears in chapter 1 and verse 7 and chapter 9 and verse 10. And here is the situation. People who fear the Lord do not merely, and I keep saying, it's not just that they have a dreadful fear of the Lord, but we must not dismiss that aspect of it. It is the person who recognizes the power of God, recognizes the holiness of God, and therefore shapes their life in conformity to his will. That's a wise person, Solomon says. Notice again what he says about the wise person in chapter 3. The wise protect themselves by guarding their words. The foolish speak pridefully and freely and are punished. So, again, there is this contrast between the wise person and the foolish person. So what does the fear of the Lord do that Solomon is suggesting to us here? The fear of the Lord is demonstrated by the way the person speaks. The fear of the Lord is demonstrated in the person's speech habits. The person is conscious of what he says and the attitude that comes out in his speech. Now, as far as Solomon is concerned, the foolish person, that person's speech is filled with pride, boast, and arrogance. That's not the way and the speech pattern of the wise. Notice what Solomon says. By the mouth, verse 3, by the mouth of a fool comes a rod for his back. He is going to be punished. He is going to be destroyed. But, again, the contrast, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. All right? So Solomon is suggesting that a part of demonstrating the fear of the Lord, a part of the fact of being wise, is being conscious of what you speak. You know, we're told that our speech in Colossians must be seasoned with salt. That's the wise person living by the fear of the Lord. Now, if we go back to Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 6, it says, the words of the wicked are to lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright shall deliver them. That is chapter 12 and verse 6. Okay, so here is the idea that Solomon is going to the speech habit. There's a very interesting metaphor here in verse 4. The scoffer of chapter 14 and verse 4, where there are no oxen in the manger is clean, but abundant crops come by the strength of the ox. Here is Solomon's point. All right, when he looks at this kind of a situation, this is one of the, and we can see in this proverb the practical application of what Solomon is trying to say. Every worthwhile pursuit has some unpleasant but necessary task. Cleaning the manger where the oxen is not a very pleasant task. He talks about everything that you do in this verse. What Solomon is suggesting to us is that everything that's worth having involves performing or may involve some unpleasant task, cleaning the manger. So nobody wants to clean an oxen stall and a cow stall. That's an unpleasant task. But Solomon says it is necessary. There are some unpleasant things that one has to do if at all the person is going to reap success. So watch him in verse 5. A faithful witness does not lie. Still talking about the speech pattern. A faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness breeds out lies. So the wise person, the upright person, the righteous person is all about speaking truth. And notice what he says about that truth. In verse 6, a scoffer seeks wisdom in vain, but knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. What we see in this contrast is that in verse 5, where he talks about a faithful witness does not lie, a scoffer seeks wisdom. So what we have in a sort of an interchange here, we have wisdom, we have knowledge, and we have understanding. So Solomon is saying the wise person is going to speak the truth. The wise person is going to be all about truth. So people who are upright, the righteous character is one who is honest, not just in terms of behavior, but honest in terms of speech. They have a deep regard for truth. All right, that is not the case with the person who is unrighteous, the person who is the foolish person. So notice he says here, I want us to look at this verse. It says in verse 5, a faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness breeds out breathes out lies. I think some translation says utters lies. But if you think of breathing out, just pouring out, just outflowing, um, those that is so typical of a person who lacks not just knowledge and wisdom and understanding, but one who is not about the fear of the Lord. All right. So, what does Solomon command of the wise? What is Solomon commanding his son in a practical way? He says, leave the presence of a fool, for there you do not meet words of knowledge. Don't keep company with a foolish person. Avoid foolish people because you cannot learn anything from them. Avoid foolish people who lie, who deceive, who are deceitful. You will not benefit from that. In fact, I use this passage very often in 1 Corinthians 15. Evil communications, and it doesn't mean speech in that way, it means evil, the manner of life. Evil communication corrupt good morals. And so Solomon is suggesting, do not associate with people like that, because they will damage your reputation. They will damage your godliness, and they will undermine your respect and your fear of the Lord. So that's what Solomon is saying here. Now, notice again how prudent and discretionary the wise is in verse number 8. The wisdom of the prudent is to discern his way, but the folly of fools is deceiving. Fools mock at the guilt offering, but the upright enjoy acceptance. What is Solomon suggesting here? Solomon is suggesting to us in this verse that the wise person will give thought to his actions, will be prudent. He will give thought to his conduct. The foolish person does not pay attention to that. In verse 9, the heart knows its own bitterness, and noise, and no stranger shares its joy. In verse 10. In other words, Solomon is suggesting here that the company that you keep, the associations that you have, are in fact, it can damage your reputation. So what Solomon does here is to look at the aspect of the speech and the daily life and behavior of the fool. Now, let's go to the second section of chapter 14, where Solomon is going to talk about the second section of chapter 14. And what he's doing here, while in verses 1 to 10, he was talking about the daily conduct, the daily lifestyle of the wise as against that of the foolish. He now looks at how does the wise as against the foolish prepare for life's end, for the end of life. Look at verse 11 through to 15, and this is where we are. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Even in laughter, the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. The backslider in heart will be filled with the fruit of his ways, and a good man will be filled with the fruit of his ways. The simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. Perhaps one of the most well-quoted verse in Proverbs is found in verse 12. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. What Solomon is discussing here is that the wise will prepare for the challenges of daily life, but more importantly, he will prepare for what comes after this earthly life. Notice how he is linking a house with a tent. All right, he's linking a house with a tent. A house being the dwelling place of a person, but a tent is more, a house rather, is more stable than a tent. And so Solomon is suggesting that we must be careful of our perception. Note when he says we must be able to make a distinction between what is real and what we perceive to be real. Notice what he says here. There's a way that seems right to a man. That's his perception. But that's not the reality. There's a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is the ways of death. So what Solomon is saying, as you prepare for that which is to come, you need to make a distinction between what is real and what is fictional. Why? Because it is going to have eternal consequences to you. Verse 13, even in laughter the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. You see, that's the perception. And here's what he says: the backslider in heart will be filled with the fruit of his ways. There is going to be an eternal reward. There is going to be a reward after this life. The good man will be filled with the fruit of the ways. The same again, and therefore as you live in this life, make sure that through knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of the will of God, you are able to discern what is lasting as against what is temporal. All right, what has eternal consequences rather than what is fixed on the here and now. All right, so that is Solomon's point in this verse. The wise give thoughts to their actions. He says in verse 15, the simple believes and follows anything. All right, the use of the word simple that keeps occurring in the Proverbs is about people who are naive and gullible. Don't be gullible. Why? Because everything that seems to be is not truly is. and if pardon my incorrect grammar. Okay, so that is what Solomon is suggesting to us. You know, if we make the application to our Christian life, here are some passages that we need to look at, especially in, well, let's look at some of them. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 14, here is Paul's injunction to us that God gave us gifts in the church, all right, for a reason, for the work of ministry and all of that. But I want to look at verse 14 of Ephesians 4. That we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive us. Christianity and its precepts, its doctrine, is not in flux. You don't believe something here today and it's no longer true tomorrow. Good? Christian values and virtues and the will of God has a certain level of fixity to it. Notice what he says again in 2 Timothy 2:15. Study to show yourself approved, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. I particularly like the idea behind this verse because rightly dividing pictures a seamstress, and what Paul is suggesting, cut straight. I am not very agile with my hands. That's not my strength. All right. And sometimes I'm cutting a piece of paper or cutting something, and following a straight line, I have to be very focused to do it. What Paul is saying here, when it comes to God's word, cut it straight. Cut straight down the line. Don't veer off. And again, he says the same idea in 2 Timothy 3:16. All scripture is given by the inspiration of God. You know, it's profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. So what is the concept here? Solomon is saying, as we live our daily life, we must be conscious of eternity, because there is a reward or there is a punishment at the end. Now, let's look at verses 16 to 27, and I won't read all of this. I'll just make a summary of what it is suggesting to us. In this section, what Solomon is doing is accenting the fear of the Lord. Yes, there are two proverbs here that ends this section. Look at verses 26 and 27. In the fear of the Lord, one has strong confidence, and his children will have a refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death. Again, Solomon comes to the idea of the fear of the Lord. And this is, as we keep saying, is a recurrent theme in the book, the fear of the Lord. All right? So, the righteous fears the Lord. And what is the benefit here of fearing the Lord? The fear of the Lord provides us the right kind of life, living waters, fountains. And it also takes us away. It affects every area of our life. That is the fear of the Lord. Now, when we get down to the latter part, to the end of this chapter, from verses 28 to the end of 35, Solomon talks about, look at verse number 28. In a multitude of people is the glory of a king, but without people a prince is ruined. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his master, his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. And verse 33, wisdom rests in the heart of a man of understanding, but it makes itself known even in the midst of fools. So again, Solomon is dealing with the fear of the Lord, as we look at in verses 50 in chapter 14. Now let's go on to chapter 15. All right, let's go on to chapter 15 and see what we can develop here in chapter 15. And Solomon is going to continue his contrast here in chapter 15. So again, we want to and we can outline the chapter like this. And what is it the chapter about? It is about, again, Solomon is continuing his contrast with the foolish and the wise. He's contrasting the wicked and the righteous. And here's how he makes the contrast in these as we follow the outline. In verses 1 to 7, now we're in chapter 15, he contrasts their speech and their words. In verses 8 to 9, he looks at the contrast between their worship and their pursuit in life in verses 8 to 9. How does the wise as against the foolish respond to discipline is found in chapter 10 through verses 10 to 12. He looks at their heart condition in verses 13 to 15. How do they value God and love is discussed in verses 16 to 17. The conduct and its consequences, that is the ways of the wise, the ways of the foolish, their conduct and its consequences are contrasted in verses 18 to 30. How they seek after wisdom, that is seeking wisdom and life, is in verses 31 through to 33. All right. Now, let us look at in chapter 15, let us look at verses 1 through to 7. And again, this is another popular verse that is often quoted from in Proverbs. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. A fool despises his father's instruction, but whoever heeds reproof is prudent. In the house of the righteous there is much treasure, but trouble befalls the income of the wicked. The lips of the wise spread knowledge, not so the hearts of fools. Now, Um, what's Solomon doing here in verses 1 to 7? When he talks about in verse 1 that the wise, a soft anger turns away wrath, but the foolish reply harshly and stir up anger. What Solomon is saying, how you deal with conflict, how do you deal with issues and problems? You can inflame a situation, make a situation worse, just by the way you respond in speech. So Solomon is asking his son to be careful of, again, your speech. All right. Now, the idea of a soft anger, we have a whole host of passages that we can look at. For instance, in 2 Chronicles 10:13, and the king answered them roughly, and King Rehoboam forsook the counsel of the old men. And of course, he's going to lead the people astray. So Rehoboam's harsh words was hurtful and it was shocking, and it caused the splitting, the division in the United Kingdom. If we look at 2 Chronicles 10, verse 16 to 19, just one of the contributing factors among the many factors that caused the division of the United Kingdom was the way Rehoboam answered. All right, Proverbs 25:15 says, by long forbearing is a prince persuaded, and the soft tongue breaketh their bones. So what Solomon is saying here is that the wise makes knowledge attractive by sharing it in the correct way. I want to read a passage to you that I think is a very good guide for us to look at when we, in fact, are trying to share the Word of God. Let me see. I should know it. Where the verse talks about that the servant of the Lord must not strive, but must be apt to teach, patient, and all of that. I thought I had it. It's a passage that I should know. That how we need to respond. That the servant of the Lord must not strive, but must be apt to teach, patient with all men, and that kind of a thing. I guess possibly that could be your assignment to find the verse. All right, but you know the verse I'm talking about. I don't remember it now. And it's not one of those things where the Holy Spirit can fill up my mouth with words. I need to have studied that verse to know it. I knew the verse, but I'm just having a difficulty finding it. Now, what we have here is the contrast between the speech of the wicked, the evil person, the unrighteous, as against the wise. So in verse 5, what we have is this, that the wise listens and learns from their parents' correction, but the foolish spurs the parents' discipline. And again, Solomon is dealing with the parent-child relationship. Okay, so we want to look at at that. Let me see where I can pick up in terms of just going over my notes. All right, now let's look at some of the key themes of Proverbs 15. Number one, the power of the tongue is one of the key themes in this verse. A gentle answer turns away wrath. And here, the idea in the word gentle is one that is soft, a soft answer, one that is tender. All right. So the power of the tongue is emphasized in chapter 15. What we also see in chapter 15 is the omniscience of God. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, watching their evil and their good, the passage tells us. What we see is the idea that the righteous will accept worship. Will perform worship. So worship and integrity plays an important part in this chapter. So the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination, but the prayer of the upright delights in the Lord. It also, we see in chapter 15, teachability, that fools despise correction, but the wise listens to reproof, and they're receptive to discipline, and that is one of the features of being wise. And the last point I want to make here in chapter 15 is that contentment and the fear of the Lord is always the best thing to have. So if we go through chapter 15, we will see these issues coming out in chapter 15. In verse 19, the way of a sluggard is like a hedge of thorns, but the path of the upright is a level pathway. You are going to get into trouble. It's not going to be to your best end if you reprove correction and discipline. Without counsel, verse 22, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. All right. So that is what we have in chapter 15. Now, when we look at chapter 16, there are certain issues that are going to come up in chapter 16. And let me just look at some of those. All right. What do we have in chapter 16? Let me just go to my notes here. In chapter 16, again, Solomon is dealing with a very important matter, and that is the power of the tongue. In verse 6, chapter 16, we will see in chapter 16 divine sovereignty and human plans. That human plans are, of course, directed by the Lord. Let's look at the outline, and then we will see, break it down for you to make it more easier. In verses 1 to 9 of chapter 16, we have a recognition of God's care and concern in verses 1 to 9. In verses 10 to 15, we have understanding rulers and their leaders. In chapter 16 and 17, those verses, I keep saying chapter, verses 16 to 17 deals with seeking wisdom and righteousness. We are to guard against pride in verses 18 to 19. We must trust the Lord and nurture wisdom, cultivate wisdom in verses 20 to 26. We must be aware of the sinful and the wicked in verse 27 to 30. And we must follow the example of the godly in verse 31 to 33. Here are some of the things that we want to emphasize in these verses. I told you that I was going to look at how these verses fit together, how these chapters fit together. So what we have in chapter 14 to 16, if we put them together, what we have here is the fear of the Lord is the root of wisdom. That the fear of the Lord shapes upright walking. The fear of the Lord gives contentment. It helps us to turn away from evil, and it guides and instructs proper worship. What we see in these chapters is that wisdom, that speech has a life or death, speech is a life or death instrument. That words can turn away wrath or it can gender strife. We also see in these verses, in these chapters, how we must deal with the poor. And so we also see the sovereignty of God and its responsibilities. That's what we're seeing in these verses. All right, I want to comment on one particular verse. Okay, the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. And again, the same kind of sentiments that we saw in chapter 14. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. James tells us that we must not say, we're going to do this tomorrow, we're going to do this next week, but we must recognize that we need to say, if the Lord permits. All right? Everyone who's arrogant in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Again, going at the nature of pride. When a man ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. You and I can plan. You and plan we must. Don't get me wrong. But as we plan, we must be conscious of the fact that, yes, we must plan, but God is the one who orders our life. God is the one who will direct our life. We are not our own bosses. So Solomon says, when a man's way please the Lord, Solomon says, the heart of man plans his ways, but the Lord establishes his ways. And look at what he says in verse 8. Better is little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice. I think the psalmist says he'd rather be a doorkeeper at the house of the Lord than to live in a palace of wickedness. Just balance and scales. Here again is the life of integrity and looking after the poor. And here is one of the other famous verses in this chapter as Solomon looks at pride. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It is better to be a lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. Again, the dangers of pride. Again, Solomon is going to say in verse 25, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates friends. Okay, and here again he comes down. Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. And what Solomon is saying, this whole idea of the nature of self-control. So what do we have here in verse 16 that's important for us to keep in mind? We need, as Solomon is doing here, so in wrapping up this class, what Solomon is doing, he looks at how we conduct our daily life. He looks at how we prepare for the life of eternity and how we live our lives in community, the idea of king's rule and the attitude that we need to have. Again, what I'm going to encourage us to do, again, I keep referring to the point that the notes that Brother Steersman has on the LMS, you need to go through it and look at it because they are very important. All right. So next class on Thursday, we will continue to go through the Psalm. We stop the Proverbs. We have done chapters 14 to 16. So we will now move on to, I think, 17 to 20 or something like that. All right. Thank you very much and happy studying.